Welcome to Biblically Lit, conversations that illuminate Scripture and ignite faith. I'm your host, MindiJoFurby, author and founder of King's Mind Books. Hi, friends. You are going to absolutely love this episode. And I'm pretty sure I can guarantee that you're going to learn something, because in just a couple of conversations that I've had with our guest, I have learned things, and I am just so excited to learn more. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Beth Button, who is the Executive Director of Snowflakes Embryo Adoption Program, which is a program under the bigger ministry of Nightlight Christian Adoptions. She has actually worked with Nightlight Christian Adoptions for almost 21 years. And she has worked with the Snowflakes team for about 9 years, and now is the director and has been for about a year and a half. She is a graduate of BYU and has lots of experience in the field of child protection and domestic violence services. She has 4 children, 3 biological and 1 adopted, and she lives right now in Kentucky with her husband and cat and a mixture of some of those children. And again, I am just so honored that she is taking the time to join us. I am most excited to learn so much of what she's going to share. So without further ado, welcome, Beth.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I'm glad you invited me.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's just dig right in. So we're going to start at the beginning. Tell us a bit about Snowflakes and what this program is and why it exists.
Sure. So Snowflakes was founded in 1997. And really the purpose of it is just to provide an option for families who have done IVF and have remaining embryos and don't want to discard them. And placing them with another family is really the only life-giving option for them. So we wanted them to have this option. And, of course, the advantage to adopting parents as well is that they may be very adoption-minded, but also really want to carry a child. And so, they're able to do that through this program.
That's amazing. So my first experience, or it's not experience, but the first time I've heard of you guys was probably about a decade ago. And I had a friend who was walking through a really serious, and she was struggling with infertility and really wanted to carry a baby. And I somehow came upon you guys, and I just thought, wow, that is such an amazing organization. The fact that you guys are in the redemptive business, right? Like, it's kind of sad that you have to exist, but the fact that you do means that you are pushing for truth and for life in the best way that you can. And so I have always just really admired, and you guys are one of the only embryo adoption agencies. You're definitely the oldest. You're the first, right? Is that correct?
Yes, we are the first. We're the oldest, and we're actually the only one who is an actual accredited adoption agency. So some organizations might use the term adoption, some might use the term donation, but we are actually the only ones who are true adoption professionals.
Interesting. Well, that's got to, that gives you automatic credibility and just trustworthiness
I think so.
for both sides, right? For people who are seeking to adopt, and then the families who have donated their embryos that they no longer, I would say want, but in some cases that definitely is true. So again, you guys are in the redemption business, and in a perfect world, you wouldn't be working in this particular job. But we're, again, very glad that you're doing it. So let's tackle an interesting and sensitive subject, and that is IVF. And just a couple of disclaimers right off the bat to people who are listening. We both acknowledge that this is a very emotionally charged topic, and especially when you're struggling with infertility, there's so many different perspectives and so many different arguments and so many different ways to go about just framing this. But one thing that really hasn't been happening, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, until recent years, is any kind of question about the morality of IVF. I think when we get a new technology and the ability to do something cutting edge, especially when it comes to babies. Like everybody loves babies, and we're for babies and we're for life. So it was for a very long time never questioned. This is obviously a good thing. This is obviously something that is morally wonderful.
Right.
But only in recent years do I think, at least from my perspective, have I seen people start to really question this and really step back and say, maybe it's not quite as on the up and up as I initially thought. But even then, this has been slow, right? This has been a very slow process. And so anyways, before we get into it, so just right off the bat, we acknowledge that this is very emotionally charged. We affirm life. We affirm the desire to want children and to have families and to raise babies. These are all wonderful, beautiful things. So we want to just say that up front. We're not anything that we say, we are committed to speaking truth. And we really want people to open their eyes and go and see IVF eyes wide open, and not just because of the way that you've heard it from media or the way that you've heard it from your doctor. And we want to kind of make sure that we're breaking through assumptions and that we are making informed decisions and that we are thinking about every subject, but particularly this, with all the knowledge and all the eyes wide open perspective that we can get. So scientifically speaking, and Beth has already corrected me on one thing about this, so I made the note. But scientifically speaking, IVF is a procedure that involves extracting and then fertilizing an egg with sperm in a laboratory, and then transferring that embryo into the uterus of a mother. Now, there's no guarantee that transfer is going to implant, but that is what IVF is. And also scientifically speaking, once that fertilization happens, so once the sperm and the egg connect, that is when you have a human being. This is scientific, this is biblical, but this is reality. And so this is something that is not really arguable really at all, because there's no grounding for it. Everybody knows that is the moment that life begins. So, but IVF has some issues. They create these embryos, and they typically, I think most of the time, I don't know exact numbers, create far more than a mother and father want or wish to transfer. And so which we'll get into all these other things, but they don't just freeze. I think the important thing, though, is to remember that, again, life begins at conception. They don't freeze sperm and then freeze eggs and then thaw them out and then create them right before they transfer. They do that. They make as many embryos as possible and then kind of put them on the shelf, so to speak, until whoever down the line decides to use them in whatever way that they decide to use them. But again, IVF does not exist in a vacuum. Typically, circumstances surrounding it, like we've already acknowledged, are very emotionally charged. And part of educating people about IVF is educating them on the dangers and then the ethical quandaries that IVF presents. So we need to present facts, and we need to be committed to speaking truth within an emotionally charged environment. So first, and this is something that we chatted about before, but the desire for children, again, is a good thing. It's a natural thing. It's a beautiful thing. However, one phrase that has been misconstrued a lot is this: we have a right to have children. We have a right, and especially people go, we have a right to have biological children. Can you kind of tackle this and explain this a little bit more for us?
Right.
Of why that's maybe not accurate.
Yeah, it's not something that people struggling with infertility want to hear. It's not something that a lot of our adopting parents want to hear. But, you know, as an adoption agency, I think one of the good things about referring to this process as adoption is that it makes it more child-centered. So it becomes not so much about my desire to have a child, but about what's best for this child. And so I think it has become, just kind of common for people to say, well, I have a right to have children. And I don't think that it's a right. I think it's a privilege, honestly. And so I think when you frame it that way, it puts more of the emphasis back on what is best for the child. And that is not, and this is nothing against, the fertility industry. I know there are people working in the fertility industry that have more of a child-centered approach. But, that industry is very much focused on helping the patient achieve what they're wanting to achieve, which is a pregnancy. And oftentimes, there are, I think, lines crossed ethically, when it comes to those attempts to meet that goal.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. And I'm really glad you said it really beautifully, because it is adult-centered. It's adult-centered, and the attention is on the desire of the adult and the outcome of making the adult happy at any and every expense. And that expense almost exclusively is at the expense of the child. It's at the expense, and then there's obviously a lot, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but embryos that don't survive and just all of these things. So that's a really great way of thinking about it. We don't have a right to have biological children. And that's been true throughout history past, until only very recently have people even thought that they could have children or that if they were infertile, that they could do that. So,
and I think too, I don't, like you said, it's a very sensitive subject, and, we recognize the huge loss that is infertility, and I don't want to minimize that at all and make it appear that we have no empathy or sympathy for people who are dealing with this. But I just, I think, honestly, the desire that we have, it probably, to have children and to parent is a God-given desire, right? I mean, Adam and Eve were commanded to multiply and replenish the earth. And so when we find that that's not happening for us biologically or genetically, that is a huge loss. And so I don't want to minimize that at all. I think it is a good desire. I just think, like you said, sometimes the means don't justify the end.
Right. Well, and I think also people don't understand. I think IVF has become the default when there are still so many options to pursue first. And really, IVF isn't all that successful either. And so when you look at the statistics and you look at the numbers, it doesn't get to the issue, the root issues of infertility. It kind of just usurps the process and says, well, we're just going to do it this way. And because it's available, it's the right move for you, where they're not actually fixing any issues that may be in existence, which can cause issues even in IVF if you don't address some of these other things, not always, but sometimes. So I think that's so well said. And it is a huge loss. It's a huge loss when you've been trying. And we've had so many dear friends who have tried for years, and some of them, there's, explainable reasons. And some of them, there has never been a medically explained reason why they can't have children. They just hadn't been able to. But again, and when you're in that moment and it's very emotionally charged, it's hard to think. It's hard to kind of step back and put things in perspective, because we become laser focused on an outcome. And to your point, we don't care how we get that outcome. We just want it. We want it now. And we've been told for decades that this is just how you do it. And why would you question it? Because it's a great thing. So I think you said that really, really well. And then we chatted about this in the first conversation that we had, but another reason that I think that we're struggling is because women are being told incorrectly that we can do everything, right? So we can go to college and get the degree. We can have the career. We can go and get our higher degree, and then we can get the promotion, and we can do all of these things. And so this is statistically true. Women are not even thinking about marriage or children until they're really in their 30s, late 20s, early 30s, or when it just starts to become a thought. And then that is past prime time, so to speak, biologically. And so these are just kind of lies that we've been believing when we're trying to have it all. And then we're surprised when we're in our mid 30s or 40s, or you even said you're hearing about women in their 50s. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. That do IVF, not necessarily that are surprised that they can't conceive, but doing IVF.
And so they're, a little bit later. So by the time they're, feeling comfortable with the idea of children is usually biologically time where that has passed. And so that's why this is just, again, we're dealing with more issues than just, I want a baby, And this is a easy way to, I say easy, it's not easy,
Right.
but it's an easy way to get what I want. So you know a little bit about this. Can you share what you've seen just personally and in your career? And again, why this isn't ideal?
Yeah. So, we do have a lot of adopting parents that come to us who, maybe they've gotten married a little bit later, or maybe, they've been married and they've just waited too long to try to conceive. And then they find out that there's an issue. And, I don't think that maybe a lot of people in the general public realize that a woman is born with all the eggs she's ever going to have. And so they just continue to age. And as they age, they become less viable, and you're, less and less likely to be able to conceive. So some of this, I feel like, goes back to maybe our educational system in the United States. Like, do kids even learn this or realize this? And so, you have women that are surprised, when they're 38 years old and their doctor is saying your eggs are too old. But yeah, I mean, that can be a very heartbreaking thing. So, and then the other thing is, we have a lot of placing parents, who are placing embryos with us, who have gone through a very similar process. And so, when they're doing IVF, their eggs are old as well. And so a lot of times a donor egg is used. Okay, so that just brings another layer of complexity, right? Because then you have the issue of, the child not having an opportunity, most likely, because, 99.9% of egg and sperm donations are anonymous. So then you have the factor of, this child is not going to have an opportunity to know much, if anything, about that genetic parent, because really that's where half of their genetics are coming from. So it does get, very complex. And that was just kind of, I think that was the infertility industry's response to these women coming when they're older is, okay, well, now you can just use a donor egg. We'll add more complexity and also significantly increase the cost for you, because donor eggs are not cheap. So yeah, it's just, we deal with a lot of people who have regrets, or at the very least are telling us, I wish I would have known this, or I wish I would have known that.
It's so heartbreaking, because again, this is a hard situation. There's not an easy out, right? And that's what we have grown accustomed to. I've said it before, but often our pursuit of happiness is translated in our minds as the expectation of happiness. And so if we expect to be happy, and we expect to get what we want. And in this day and age, we expect to get it now. We don't want to wait.
It's true.
And so we just are curious. And again, that laser focused, what can we do right now to get what we want right now in the moment, and everything else can fall by the wayside. And just, I'm hearing more and more stories of regret, more and more stories of people. I've had conversations with friends whose, friends have had IVF, who family members go through IVF, and they've never even thought about these kinds of questions and about what, the process itself isn't fun. It's very, very hard. And to your point too, you're at this point, you're not even having 100% biological child in a lot of these cases, because you're using the donor of this or that or the other. And so that again makes it adult focused and not child focused, because that child, I believe, has the right to their biological parents. And that is, are you familiar with Katie Faust and Them Before Us, the organization Them Before Us?
Yes.
So I just picked up her book, but I think they do a really good job of explaining like what natural rights are. And it's, a right is something that is pre-government. A right is something that no one gives you, you have it. And then a right is something that comes equally to you. So you think, your right to self-defense, everybody has that right, the right to life. But their argument is everyone has a right to their biological parents, because as you said just so beautifully, when you are conceived through donor egg or sperm, you are missing at least half of your identity and your genetic identity and your biological identity. And there are questions that come up, and there are studies that have been doing where people are growing up as IVF babies, and they are honestly having meltdowns, identity crisis, because they're like, who am I? And I can't, when I meet with a primary physician for the first time, I can't answer lots of the questions because I have no idea what my medical history is with my, my biological father or my biological mother. So there's just a lot that goes into this. And to your point too, we need to be educated. And I agree with you. I don't think this is being taught. I don't think people are talking about this, because otherwise we wouldn't be having to have these conversations. And when we do, not staring at someone who's just like, I never.
I mean, a lot of people, you'd be surprised how many people don't know the difference between an egg and an embryo. So, I mean,
wow,
that's something we're educating on pretty often.
Really?
So, yeah.
That basic. Golly.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't want to say, I'm shocked by that, but then I guess I shouldn't be so shocked by that, because when you're pro-choice, I don't think many pro-choice people or advocates really understand just basic biology and how this works. Because it's easier, frankly, it's easier not to, because
they don't want to understand, probably.
Right, because once you acknowledge that the embryo is a life, all their arguments go out the window. But golly, that's hard. But that's shocking to me that people aren't even educated enough on this topic to know even that distinction. That is wild. And my next question was what you've already brought up, but IVF is another example that children are being put last, and no one considers the children because they're too busy thinking of what they want and when they want it. And they're being thought of as tokens and as commodities more than human beings, and then most importantly, more than fellow image bearers of God. And this is something I've been noticing in our culture for a while now, but it really... So I'll let you talk first, but what other ways have you really noticed this, children being put last in this whole process? You've mentioned a few things, but is there anything else in all of your experience?
Well, I think one major issue right now that has become very popular and is being pushed at fertility clinics is pre-genetic implantation testing. So, most physicians are encouraging their patients to pay the extra money, which is, I think at a minimum, usually $3,000, and then that goes up, to have the embryos genetically tested before they transfer any of them. And the problem with that is you can ask other doctors who will tell you that doing that testing is not proven to increase the odds of pregnancy whatsoever. And there's also plenty of research to support the fact that it is not necessarily accurate. And so what happens is, if an embryo tests as abnormal, there's not a clinic in the United States that will accept that embryo into their facility and do a frozen embryo transfer with that embryo. So even if it was a false result, that embryo is automatically doomed. That's it. End of the line. So, and then it also kind of plays into the whole, really getting into eugenics, because there's a company now that will test, for various huge list of things, from eye color to, anything. And then, people will select those embryos that meet their criteria. And, it started with just gender, which to me, it's bad enough that you're only selecting an embryo based on gender, but now you're getting into the nuts and bolts of, minor diseases that you will not accept in a child, and hair and eye color. So it's pretty scary. It's a very slippery slope. And unfortunately, especially compared to other countries like European countries, IVF is not regulated here. It's kind of just a free-for-all. There's no limit on how many embryos can be created. There's no limit on how long they can be stored. So, yeah, a lot of freedom to take liberties with an embryo's life, basically.
Goodness gracious. So I didn't realize it was quite to the extent that it wasn't regulated at all. That's crazy, because you'd think this is big creation order stuff. I mean, you're literally creating life. How could there be regulations on, our food? And how could there be regulations on things like this and not on creating and then subsequently discarding life?
And I shouldn't say there's no regulation at all. I mean, it falls under the umbrella of the FDA. Okay. And there's certain, infectious diseases, testing that they'll require, and, they'll come and inspect a lab. But as far as, those limits on how many to create, how many can be frozen for how long, there's no limit. And there's no other than a couple states, there's no, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, it's been a long day. You can basically just discard or destroy an embryo, at will, if the patient doesn't want to use it, or if you feel like it's, not going to result in a pregnancy, then, you can just go ahead and discard it without any consequence.
That is crazy. So
that's the word I'm looking for. There's no consequence for discarding embryos. Thank you.
There's no consequence. But, oh my goodness. So, okay. So you have been talking to people who don't even realize what an embryo is and the distinction between an egg and embryo. Do you think that people still don't realize that distinction if having gone through that process? Do you think that they, if they've gone through the IVF, do you think they have to know?
If they've been through IVF, they know. But we have adopting parents who maybe don't know, or just, people who will, in the general public, who might talk to us about our jobs or whatever, and we're explaining what we do on the Snowflakes team. They may not have a clear understanding. And we hear it a lot from adopting families who are trying to explain their adoption process to their friends and family, that they're really having to get into the very basic birds and the bees to explain exactly what they're doing and what's happening.
That's so interesting. Well, the reason I ask is because, we do know that people do discard their frozen embryos. This happens
on a daily basis.
On a daily basis. So, but that, I guess, is where it's just breaking my heart and just blowing my mind, knowing that you have an embryo that is a life and that you can just flippantly discard because they didn't meet your expectation, or because you already have X amount of children and that's the only amount that you wanted.
Right.
Or I've even seen, I read an article, and I think it was from Australia or something. People are having their embryos that they don't want anymore made into jewelry.
Oh, I saw that too. Isn't that awful? Yes. Yeah, there's a company that will make it into jewelry for you.
So you have your embryo shipped to this company and they'll make it into a ring. So you're literally wearing your child that you created,
basically
and then
destroyed,
murdered
as
a piece of jewelry, and then boasting about it. This post in this article that I saw, this woman it was almost as if it was like an ashes, a loved one passed away, and they, you can make jewelry with a loved one's ashes. It was almost that idea, I think, or at least in her mind, it was what I was like, that is so not the same thing.
Right. Well, and I think, what it boils down to, and I think the people that are choosing to discard the embryos is, they have believed whatever they've heard about, it's not a baby, it's just a clump of cells. I love that term, a clump of cells.
I'm a clump of cells.
Yeah, we're all a clump of cells. But the bottom line is that clump of cells has a full set of DNA, and we can determine genetic diseases and the sex. So how is that not a human being?
A person. Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, and then, I know I'm kind of jumping ahead, but we can get into it now. This becomes eugenics. So I think you're right about it being a slippery slope. I could conceive of a world of morality that's okay for IVF if the parents create, just a very small amount of embryos, and then they choose to transfer them nearly immediately without doing any genetic testing or anything, because that they know what's happening and that's their goal. When you're child focused and you want what's best for the child, that would be the way to do it. Is, okay, I can't conceive naturally for whatever reason, so I am going to do IVF, but I'm not going to do the genetic testing. As soon as those embryos are made, I'm going to have them transferred, and then we'll just do it that way. So I could conceive of that being on decently moral grounds, but you know more than I do that is not where it has stopped by any stretch of the imagination. And so when you're starting to get into this genetic testing, I've heard too that the process of doing that is very invasive is the right word, but like the embryos kind of endure a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a risk that just that process of sticking that needle in there to get that biopsy is going to destroy the embryo. So right off the bat, they're at risk. And then, of course, if there are found to be any genetic abnormalities, then, that's it.
So no lab, well, and then just the fact that you said, I'm kind of jumping around, stick with the eugenic part, but this is where it gets scary, though, and that's the slippery slope that you were referencing before, because it's not just egg, sperm, together, implant. That can happen, and maybe it does in a very small, amount of cases, but most of the time that's not happening, because IVF is still an expensive process, and so the goal is to make kind of as many, and please jump in if I'm wrong at any point, but the goal is to make kind of as many as you can make, and then you do the testing, you make sure they're all good or up to standard, and then you freeze the ones that you don't want to immediately transfer. And then if your transfer fails, then you can, move on to the next one until it takes.
Yeah. And that, that's just another layer is where the money comes in, right? Because IVF is not cheap. And so that's the justification of creating so many at a time, is that then we have backups and we don't have to go through this again, which I understand. But again, that is an adult focused problem and not something that focuses on the best interest of the embryos.
Because again, these embryos are babies. They are people. They have everything that they're going to need. And at conception, you have as many eggs, just like you mentioned before, as many eggs as you're ever going to have. So that the expense of it is crazy. So I get you want to get the most bang for your buck, I guess, which is a crude way of saying it. So it's understandable. But again, people aren't really thinking it all the way through. They're like, oh, well, that makes sense. So let's make 15, knowing you're never going to transfer probably 15. But then to your point of just getting kind of more to the eugenic aspect of it, I didn't realize that if there's any kind of, abnormality or, whatever, that people just won't. They'll refuse to transfer it. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, we have. So Snowflakes partners with a network of fertility clinics across the U.S. And we have over 40 referral clinics that we use. And some of them have multiple locations. So people have a lot of options. Most people don't have to travel far to get to one of our partner clinics. But there's only 2 of them where the doctors are pro-life, where they would, consider transferring embryos that other facilities won't. And yeah, I'm already a little bit panicked about what's going to happen when those 2 retire, because I don't know. I mean, clinics have gotten a lot more picky about the embryos that they'll accept. Even in the 9 years that I've been on the team, I've seen that happening, where if they're not graded a certain quality, if the egg donor is over a certain age, if they've been frozen, a certain length of time, they won't accept those embryos into their facility. So it's really limiting us on making matches, because we're accepting all embryos. But if clinics won't accept them, we have a problem, because that's not something that people can do themselves.
Well, right. Oh my goodness. Well, and then, and then to your point of not even being accurate. So you can get false positives. If they say that, they do the genetic testing and they say, oh, well, this embryo might have this, or even if they say this embryo does have this and they're wrong, they are forever, almost always pushed aside or are they destroyed in that moment usually?
I think probably, I'm sure they're getting the patient's consent, but my understanding is that quite often, they're just automatically discarding any embryo that is tested as being abnormal. There's another level kind of between normal and abnormal called mosaic. And so there are clinics, and definitely the two that, that are more pro-life that we work with, that will accept and transfer mosaic embryos. But a lot of times these facilities will only accept them if there's others in that set who have not tested as mosaic or abnormal. So, and then they're still always going to use what they consider the highest quality embryos first.
Right.
So, if there's a set of 4 embryos and 2 are normal and 2 are mosaic, and a family's fortunate enough to have 2 children from the first 2 embryos, and then they try to return the other 2 mosaic ones, then we're very challenged in trying to rematch those with another family. So it's almost like they're just doomed once they get that label slapped on them. So yeah, it's really sad.
It is really sad because, and you think about it from, not even IVF, but you think about it from a naturally conceived baby, and you're pregnant and you have tests done. We never did elective testing, but that is very frequent. They're wrong then too. So often. I have had so many friends who doctors have said, you really should abort because this baby is going to, have this.
Right.
And we, at our 20 week with one of our daughters, didn't look like she had a stomach. They couldn't find her stomach, which was, terrifying.
Big deal.
And we went, back a couple times, and then they ended up finding it. I don't know, but it was just, the point is, I feel like there is a very big rush to put that label on, to put that stamp on the baby, whether it's an embryo through IVF or even in the womb of moms who have conceived naturally. Like, this one's not good enough. This one might have issues, or this one is going to have issues, and their quality of life is going to suffer. So kill the baby. And it's like, why is this our default in the medical realm? Why are we so quick to slap that label on, which, to your point, is going to be on them forever, especially in IVF as an embryo, because they don't have a chance to prove anybody wrong. And it's a lost cause. So just guess, do you have a percent? I know I'm putting you on the spot, so if you don't know, it's totally fine. But what amount of these embryos are discarded? I would imagine the majority.
I mean, I would say the majority of abnormal embryos are discarded, or they're just frozen indefinitely because the patient doesn't want to discard them, but they really don't have any other option. There is a facility, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the name. I want to say Sacred Heart Guardians. They will actually provide like a memorial and even burial service for families who, are faced with that option and, go ahead and have to discard them. At least they can honor them that way, rather than just, having them discarded as medical waste. But it really, it kind of seals their fate. And, even patients who believe that these embryos are life, they just don't have any options anymore at that point.
Golly,
so
that kills me. And then to your point of people, these are the people who care, and these are the people who recognize, and they're really put in an impossible situation because they can't do anything. But the other side of that pendulum is people who don't care, people who want the genetically perfect embryo, who not just want the genetically perfect, want the blue-eyed, want the blonde hair or the red hair or the whatever. They want to kind of put their little Barbie doll together and have it exactly as they want it to be. And that obviously is awful, but this is a big part of what's happening in IVF.
Yeah, and another interesting thing we're finding that we've had families place embryos with us 2 and 3 times. And so I think what's happening is they are doing a round of IVF, and maybe the embryos that result aren't looking the quality that their doctor wants them to be or whatever. So they'll freeze those and then do another round of IVF before they've even used the first ones. And so, they're just piling up, waiting for them to get the perfect embryo to transfer. It's very interesting. Yeah, to me, that should be like part of the regulations that you can't do a second round of IVF until you have made a decision about the first set of embryos you've created.
Right.
But that is also not the case. So I don't remember who it is, but I was just reading. I don't want to say a name, even though I think I know who it is in case I'm wrong.
I guess so, yeah.
But she created, I think, 18 or 20 embryos, and they were all one gender. And that wasn't the gender she wanted. So then she did another round of IVF so that she could get some of the other gender. And so that first 18 or 20, I assume, is either sitting there in frozen storage or has been discarded because they were the wrong gender. So, yeah, and that's a lot of embryos.
That's a lot of babies that were murdered because the parent wanted a specific gender over another. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. That's hard to swallow.
Yeah.
My heart just breaks for them. That's hard. That's hard. Okay. So walk us through the IVF process. So, I mean, I think a lot of people understand the basics of like what I said, but I don't think a lot of people understand that it's very much more involved than just, we'll take a little egg quickly over here and a little sperm and we'll just,
Right.
put it together.
Yeah. So, I think, when you have a couple that's pursuing this together, they're first testing both, to see if there's that most likely they have a diagnosis by then. So, if it's, a problem, if it's a male factor issue, then they're most likely going to choose donor sperm. And if it's an issue with the egg, then they're going to use a donor egg. About half of all embryos are created with donor gametes. So pretty high number. I actually have always been surprised it's not even higher than that. But about half are created with donor gametes. And, most of the time, doctors are doing and often don't offer an option to do otherwise. They do what's called a medicated cycle. So, you've probably seen people having to give themselves these hormone injections, and that's to stimulate the reproductive system and prepare the uterus for the embryo to be transferred. And then, it's, I believe that most of the time, all of the embryo, I think it's pretty rare to do a fresh cycle, which is where the embryo hasn't been frozen first. So most of the time they have been frozen, and so then they're just thawing out, generally 1 or 2 at a time. I will say, since I feel like I've bashed the fertility industry so much tonight, one good thing is that I do feel like the doctors have gotten more responsible in not creating quite as many embryos. We had a family donate 30 embryos to us at one point. They said they didn't realize their doctor was creating that many, but there's no couple on earth who is going to realistically use 30 embryos. So we are seeing smaller sets being created. And the other thing is, it is very uncommon to find that they will transfer more than 2 at a time. So there will never be another octomom who has, octuplets through IVF. I firmly believe that, at least in the US. So that's a good thing. But yeah, so then, all of those other embryos just remain frozen. And then if they don't achieve a pregnancy, usually they'll wait a couple months and then start over again with, whatever remaining embryos they have. But yeah, I would say, quite a few families, even if the doctor has been more conservative, will have remaining embryos, because you're looking at the fact that just in general, people don't want as large a family, right? I mean, people are happy with 1 or 2 children. They have a set of twins with their first pregnancy. A lot of them are just done. And then the other thing is, like we talked about, people are starting this at a later age. And so if they have their first baby at 45 or 46, they're not going to end up having a large family.
No. Well, and that's exactly what I said when you said about twins. I was like, well, yeah. And if they're in their early 40s, that's a lot just in general. But then you're not thinking, oh yeah, I want, 1 or 2 or 12 more, especially at that point.
Yeah. Golly. I don't think there's not a commitment to giving each embryo an opportunity to be born. There's not a commitment by most of the patients, and there's certainly not a commitment by the reproductive endocrinologist. It's just, these are remaining or backup or leftover or whatever term you want to use. But, I think it's very unusual for anyone to go into it with eyes wide open saying, we only want 3 children. Please don't create more than 3 embryos because we want to give each of them a chance to be born. That just isn't happening.
Which breaks my heart. When I read a statistic that said, let me see if I have it. I think I do have it. In the Them Before Us book I was reading, and they quote, it was on their website, some of their quick facts on their website, but they cited an article that was written that said only approximately, because there aren't hard and fast numbers on this, because this isn't really being tracked very well.
You're right.
But they, as far as they could estimate, only 7% of created embryos are born alive. And that was staggering to me. And it was an article from the UK, and they somehow did some research, and there was 1.5 million embryos that were created that they were able to track, and only 7% of those were born alive. And it's like,
I can see that being accurate. I mean, when you think about how many are still in storage, and, if a couple creates 10 embryos and they only use 3 of them, more than half of the ones they created are still sitting in storage. And then, you have to look at this has improved. But, not all embryos are going to even survive the thawing process. So, that's a challenge they have to overcome as well.
Yeah. Do you have the statistic?
I did. I actually wrote down. So clinics are required to report certain data to the CDC.
Okay.
And then anyone can access that. So this is the reason that they are so hell-bent on using only what they consider the highest quality embryos and doing the PGT testing, because they believe it will affect their outcomes. Because if a patient looks and they're comparing 2 clinics, and one has a 40% success rate and one has a 55% success rate, which clinic are they going to choose?
Right.
So, but yeah, so we just have, we have our data through Snowflakes. So, in the past, about 500 embryo transfers that our families have done, 79% have survived the thaw, which is actually quite a bit higher than it was just 8 or 10 years ago. So, that's a positive, but still, that's 21% that didn't survive the thaw. And then for just looking at last year, for 2024, we had a 59% success rate of embryos that survived the thaw and were transferred, actually resulting in pregnancy. So yeah, and the rate of, there is, miscarriages taking place, just like with a natural conception. So, and that the miscarriage rate is actually not any higher than it would be for someone conceiving naturally. But, it does happen. So.
And you're right that those numbers have improved, because I know back, 5-10 years ago, they were drastically, at one point, it was only a 40% survival.
Yeah, I think when I joined the team, like I said, close to 9 years ago, it wasn't much over 50%, even for our snowflakes, just for our snowflakes embryos. And I think that has to do more with advancements in the technology used to freeze the embryos. And they're just more likely to survive the thawing process now than they were.
Which is definitely good, but you're right. That's still 21% of babies who don't even survive that part. And then there's the percentage, which is even bigger, of babies who don't actually implant. They are transferred, but they don't take, so to speak.
Exactly.
And that's heartbreaking because, again, these are babies. These are human beings, and knowing that they're being created with really not the best odds. The odds are all against them, it seems like, from the very beginning.
Right. And I think it's important too, because, some people would argue, I could see somebody watching this right now and saying, well, not every embryo is going to survive, even if it wasn't created through IVF. And that's absolutely true. And, people have miscarriages all the time. But I think the difference is that we're allowing that to happen naturally. Nature's taking its course. We're turning that over to God versus we're controlling it and causing,
we're playing God.
The destruction of the embryos. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to your earlier point of that's an adult-centered focus and not a child edifying one. When we're taking this process in our hands, we are creating the child on our terms. We're choosing the child that we want best. We're choosing the timing of this when we want best. We are in control, or we think we're in control. We're trying to take control and usurp control from the literal creator of humans, and that is God. So you're right. It does happen naturally. And I don't think there can be accurate statistics on those numbers, because there are miscarriages that happen well before they even know. Exactly.
Yeah, I agree.
So this does happen naturally, but you're right. When it's happening naturally, that isn't something that a parent is trying to manipulate. It's not something that a parent is trying to control. It's not a parent saying, I'm going to create this child. I'm going to create this many children, embryos, knowing that some of these are going to die. It's and because the chances of anyway, they're low. So so you're right.
And the other thing, Mindi, that's really frustrating to me is that clinics and embryologists are deciding based on not very concrete data which embryos deserve a chance to be transferred. And it doesn't matter how many times we see and we tell people that these embryos that were graded very poorly have resulted in a perfectly healthy pregnancy and baby. They are still convinced that they only should use the highest graded embryos. But even the embryo grading system is not, it's just completely like the opinion of an embryologist. And one embryologist might give a completely different grade than another one. And yet clinics are relying on this. They're relying on the PGT, even when it's been shown to not be accurate. And then I think the worst part is that patients are believing it. I mean, because they're coming to us, those that have dealt with, infertility treatment and then come to Snowflakes are saying to us, we want PGT tested embryos. We want embryos that were frozen after 2010, or, because they're just kind of spitting back these things that they've heard. Meanwhile, I can't tell you how many times I've had a family tell me, they adopted 6 embryos or 7 embryos, and, their doctor started, with the highest quality embryo. And in one case, the doctor, he just kind of considered it like a mercy transfer. When they got to the last embryo and there hadn't been a pregnancy yet, he said, there's no way this is going to result in a baby. I'm not even going to make you do a medicated cycle. We'll just go ahead and base this on your natural cycle. We'll go ahead and do a transfer. And then, of course, that was the one embryo of that set of 6 that resulted in a perfectly healthy baby with not a thing wrong with it and no genetic abnormalities. So, that's not the only family that's told me that. We've had several similar situations. So it's frustrating that they're hearing something so different from a fertility clinic and then coming to us with that mindset that we have to then re-educate them and try to just get them to switch from that adult-centered approach to the child-centered approach.
Well, and it's also medical versus reality versus theological. We're divorcing our worldviews, especially as Christians, but just like morally aware, people who are trying to do the right thing, which I hope is everybody. But you hear, in the medical field, there's this push on science, right? Push on medicine. Well, this is the best chances. So scientifically speaking, this is the best one. And I get that because they're scientists and they're doctors and they're embryologists. So like that's where they're coming from because that's how they've been trained and that's how they've been trained to think. You want the best possible outcome. And again, that's not a bad thing, but they're divorcing that from definitely a biblical and a Christian worldview. They're putting this in a scientific worldview and completely separating it from the reality that these are babies and they're losing sight of that reality, or so it seems. And so when you have people who are parroting this back to you, it sounds like they're not understanding that either. They are receiving a download of information that is based in science and based in, just trying to do the best of the best of the best of the best, scientifically speaking, and not thinking outside of those boxes and outside of the parameters.
Yeah, I mean, they've waited this long for a child. They might have been trying for years and years. They might have spent, $20, $30, $40,000 by this point. And plus, in our culture, we are basically brought up to trust our doctors. And whatever they tell us, we need to believe that. And I think that's why this is happening.
It's so hard. Well, I could actually share a few more things on that, but we're going to go because I don't want to take up all of your time. So circling back to snowflakes, we do not need more babies filling up freezers. We have do you know what the number is? Our estimated number of frozen embryos?
So there was a study back, let me see, I wrote it down because I always forget. In 2003, they estimated 400,000 embryos. And again, this is not tracked.
Right.
So to get a number, you would have to call, every one of the 400 plus fertility clinics and find out how many embryos they had in storage at that given time. And then around 2020, they came out and said, well, it's at least 1 million. And so kind of the number that's being thrown around now is 1.5 million are in frozen storage. I mean, some people think there's even more, and it wouldn't surprise me if there were even more. I just don't, even though, doctors may be a little more responsible than they were in not creating as big of an excess, IVF isn't going away. And so, I've even had I had somebody interview me once that suggested that maybe Snowflakes was somehow promoting IVF because it would put us out of business if we didn't have embryos, to match with adoptive families. That's not a concern of mine because I could speak out against IVF all day long and it's still going to be happening. And there are always going to be embryos that need a home. And I just hope that it doesn't continue to grow astronomically like it has been. But definitely, the percentage of children born through IVF and the percentage of adults doing IVF continues to grow.
Continues to rise. Okay, so many more things that I could chat about, but I want to end this with kind of picking your brain, and because you have so much experience and so much wisdom. So for the young couple or a little bit older couple who is experiencing infertility, what advice do you give them up front?
Yeah, so, I have not done a lot of research into this because I feel like it's kind of out of my realm, but I think there's been a push in some circles to really look at restorative medicine. And so, typically the process is, if you're under a certain age, I think it might be 35 or 40, you try for a year. And then if you don't conceive naturally, you go to the doctor. If you're older, they'll see you if it's only been 6 months of training. And then, they might try Clomid or a similar drug. If that doesn't work, they move on to intrauterine insemination. If that doesn't work, it's like, okay, IVF is your only option. And, they're not looking at what can we do to restore fertility and maybe address some of the issues that could be treating it. They're just kind of taking that, you get to that third step of IVF and that's your only choice. And people, are believing that. So that would be the first thing, is I would say, maybe look at other options rather than even your just typical fertility clinic. And then the other thing is, consider embryo adoption. We have many families come to us who have done IVF. They don't learn about embryo adoption through their clinic. Their clinic wants them to do IVF, right? And not all of them are this underhanded, but I do definitely believe that part of that motivation is that they're going to make more money from doing IVF, and they're going to be able to boost their success rates. Whereas if they just do a frozen embryo transfer for a couple, they have doubts at the success, and they're also not going to make as much money. I mean, that's the bottom line. So, sorry, I feel like I got off track a little bit.
No, that's great advice.
But yeah, there are many couples who have come to us who have said, we have never heard of embryo adoption, or we hadn't. And if we had known about it before, we never would have even done IVF, which is kind of heartbreaking, right? Yeah. So we really, definitely want to just educate people as much as we can that it is an option. And even if people learn about it but don't choose to pursue it at that time, or even if they can just educate someone else about it who is struggling with infertility. But yeah, I mean, we do have families come to us and say, why create more embryos when there's already so many that need a home? And I really appreciate that attitude, because there are a lot of other people that I think are really caught up on needing or wanting to have a genetic child. That's hard for me to relate to sometimes, because I am an adoptive mom, and I certainly don't love my adopted son any less than my biological kids. And so that sometimes is an attitude that's hard for me to wrap my head around, because I just love all kids. But I think getting people maybe past that sometimes. And yeah, just the education and just considering it, learning, go online and do your research. If you go to one doctor and he tells you something you're not sure about, get a second opinion. Don't put all of your eggs in that basket. No pun intended. Yeah.
Oh, I think that's great advice. And you answered my next question, which is some practical things we could do to educate ourselves. It's just research. Do your research. Go online. Talk to people who have done it. Just go in with eyes wide open. Don't get so laser focused that's driven purely on emotions. Even if those emotions have been driven by a good thing and a good desire, go in eyes wide open. See what your options are, because there's a chance that maybe God wants you to adopt one of the 1.5 million babies who are frozen right now, and give that baby a chance at life. And I don't know, but that is happening, and it's so beautiful. It's so beautiful when he chooses to write a story that might be different than what you expected, but is just as or even more beautiful than what you would have written if you held the pen.
Yeah, it's really important to just along those lines that, if you're having a child through embryo adoption, or if you're adopting an already born child, that what you're communicating to that child is not that, this option was the second best option, right? It's a different option. Yes. It's not what we expected or planned on, but it's not any less, and you're not any less, because you came to our family a different way than what we maybe expected. Exactly.
Well, and that's a great point too. And it's actually one that I planned on mentioning on my caveat section at the beginning. But are we saying at all that IVF babies are mistakes, or IVF babies are less than? Absolutely not. Every child is created by God and precious and bears the image of God. We love everybody because we are all image bearers of God. So absolutely not. They are not mistakes. What our goal is to educate so we can maybe bring that 1.5 million number down substantially and start looking at this in a more ethical way and a more biblically accurate way, and according to a biblical worldview, which says that all people are created in God's image. And we need to be real careful when we start putting ourselves in control and start putting ourselves and playing God, because that's what we're doing to a large extent. So we need to check motivations and things like that, but not 1 second, not one bit do we think that babies who are born from IVF are any way less than or mistakes or anything like that. They are sweet. And that's why we care so much about these frozen embryos, is because they are image bearers of God, and they're people.
Valuable.
They are very valuable. Okay, so last question, how can people support Snowflakes?
Yeah, so I think, one big way, which I already mentioned, is just talking about it and educating. I think, too, it's important to mention for families who have embryos that they're considering placing for adoption, there is no shelf life for embryos. We have an adoptive couple right now who's pregnant, and their embryo was frozen for 30 and a half years. So when that baby's born, that will be a record. The record right now is like 29 and a half years.
Oh my goodness.
So, there isn't a shelf life. However, like I mentioned, clinics are quite picky. And, so the longer an embryo is frozen, the less likely a clinic is going to be, to accept it on behalf of an adopting family. And the other thing is, medical facilities are not required to keep medical records indefinitely. So if the embryology records and the other information about the embryos happens to be destroyed, well, guess what? A fertility clinic is not going to accept those embryos if they don't have that information. And so that's another way we see people just get stuck. And it is not, I don't want to minimize it at all, because just kind of similar to the grief that people go through with infertility, placing embryos with another family that you thought would become part of your family is also very emotional and very difficult for a lot of our couples. And, I've got a couple friends who have struggled with this for years. And, one of them is just now finally moving forward with placing their embryos, and it's been 20 years. And the other one still isn't there, and their embryos are still in storage. So, we have resources to help people with that. We actually have a placing parent support group now that runs a few times a year, just kind of helping people get through those difficult emotions and get to a place of peace, where they're ready to move forward. So that'll be my other advice is, as far as getting the word out, yes, it's awesome. We're going to have this huge story about how this is a record, length of being frozen, resulting in a birth. But at the same time, we don't want people to think, oh, well, good, I've got 30 more years to decide to place my embryos, because you don't.
Right.
And then the other thing is, I'll just put a plug in for this. We are a nonprofit agency. And so, anyone who just feels a heart for this program and would want to even financially support it, it can go into our general fund. It can go, they can specify that they want it to go towards an adopting family to help with their Snowflakes adoption expenses. But yeah, any support like that, we welcome that. And just, we have social media pages. So, you can follow Snowflakes on on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, even, just kind of supporting those, and even just giving us a like every now and again will boost that.
Yes.
So that we can then educate more people.
Yes.
Who happen to be just scrolling through social media.
I love that. Well, so people listening, do that. Do all of those things. I'm going to add.
Please do those things.
Please do all those things. And for my brothers and sisters in Christ, I'm going to challenge you to pray. I'm going to challenge you to pray for Snowflakes. I'm going to challenge you to pray for the placement families. I'm going to challenge you to pray for the donors who are going through this really hard time of letting that go, letting a dream go, letting what they thought life, that would be like, letting that go, having that peace. This is so involved, and it's very emotional it's very emotional. IVF is very emotional, but this is also very emotional. And so that is my parting word to you who are listening, that you would see, that you would see what's going on, that you would be educated, that you would open your eyes to the truth and to the reality of this industry and what's happening in it, and that you would become an advocate or continue to be a stronger advocate for life, understanding what that means, and that you would really support organizations like Snowflakes, especially. You are literally the pioneers in this field. So support them, do all of those things and more, and tell your friends about them. Continue to just raise awareness, spread the word, get it out there. Let's bring this number down, friends. Let's bring this number down. So Beth, I'm just so grateful that you took the time to be here. I learned a lot and am super motivated to go out and spread the word even more. And I just am so grateful for the work that Snowflakes does and Nightlight. And just know that I am rooting for you and will forever be your guys' cheerleader.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you just, giving me an opportunity to be on this platform, because again, just spreading the word is so important. There's so many people who still have never heard of embryo adoption.
Yeah.
So,
there's going to be hopefully a big chunk that can't say that after watching this, listening to this. So, okay. Well, thank you so much again. And friends, and those who are listening, I'm sure like me, you probably have some questions, and Snowflakes has a great website with a whole bunch of different resources that you can look at. And I'm sure you guys have a contact, page where if you have questions,
they can call us, or there's also just an inquiry form that they can fill out really quick online that comes to us by email, and then we'll give you a call or send you an email with some more information. So
perfect. So if you have questions, even if it's philosophical questions, like what about this or about the process, we're in the education business, so reach out to them. They have a beautiful website, and there's the pictures. I got lost in the pictures of the babies that have been born,
and those are all Snowflakes babies. Those are not just
models.
Those random,
I just wanted to pick up
those
the squish.
Those are our babies. Yeah.
I love that so much. So I got lost just like looking. I'm like, look at them. Anyway, so yes, get in touch, ask questions, get involved. And again, don't be content with the status quo. Don't be content just kind of drifting and be just not thinking about this because it's convenient or easy, or just going with the flow because that's what your doctor told you to do, or that's what social media has told you to do. Ask questions, think hard things, think critically, and support these embryos, support these babies who are frozen right now, however you can. And I'm going to leave that between you and the Lord. But again, thank you so much, Beth. And I just am so thankful for you guys and what you do.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.